The body of a University of South Florida doctoral student was found this morning, but his girlfriend, Nahida Bristy, is still missing. The person arrested in connection with the case was his own roommate. Police took Zama's roommate into custody after a standoff. According to reports, he had barricaded himself inside the apartment. The roommate is now facing charges including domestic violence, battery, false imprisonment. Zama was last seen at an off-campus apartment, the same apartment he shared with the roommate. Nahida was last seen on campus near a science building where some of her belongings were reportedly left behind. At that time, she might also have met the roommate, according to some detectives. Zama's body was found near the bridge, so it is possible that Nahida was thrown into the water. Both of them were PhD students at USF. They were also a couple and may have even been considering getting married. The roommate had a very violent criminal history.
2 PhD students disappeared. Police thought it was a missing persons case, until one of them was found dead, and the other gone without a trace. But here's what makes this story terrifying. The man accused of killing them wasn't a stranger. He lived with them. This is the case of Zamil Limon and Nahida Bristy, 2 27-year-old doctoral students at the University of South Florida who came to America chasing a better future. On April 16, 2026, they were seen just hours apart. Zamil, at his off-campus home. Nahida, shortly after. Then suddenly, silence. No calls. No messages. No digital trace. It was like they had been erased. By the next day, panic had already begun. Because this wasn't normal. People who knew them knew something was wrong. And then, a discovery was made on the Howard Frankland Bridge. A discovery that turned this case from missing persons into a murder investigation. Only one of them had been found. The other? Still missing. And as investigators dug deeper, everything pointed back to one person. Hisham Abugharbieh. Their roommate. The person who shared their space. Their routine. Their trust. So the question is, what really happened inside that apartment, the night they vanished? And why is Nahida Bristy still missing? Welcome to Crime Gazette, your home for gripping true crime stories that keep you on edge. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps us keep bringing you powerful, real stories like this. The last time anyone saw them, nothing felt out of place. It was a normal Thursday morning near the University of South Florida. Students walked to class with headphones in, coffee cups in hand, deadlines on their minds. Life moved the way it always did, fast, focused routine. And somewhere within that routine, Zamil Limon stepped outside his off-campus apartment just 3 blocks from campus. It was around 9 a.m. There was nothing unusual about him. No signs of distress. No urgency in his movements. Just another doctoral student starting his day. An hour later, Nahida Bristy was seen too. Alive. Calm. Unaware. No one knew those would be the last confirmed moments anyone would see them. Because after that, they vanished. At first, no one panicked. 2 graduate students missing for a few hours? It wasn't unheard of. People get busy. Phones die. Schedules change. Especially for PhD students buried in research and deadlines. But as the hours passed, something began to feel off. Calls went unanswered. Messages stayed unread. Their phones, both of them, went silent at the same time. And that detail would haunt this case. Because it wasn't just that they disappeared. It was how perfectly synchronized it was. By the next day, concern had turned into fear. A family friend, unable to reach either of them, made the call that would set everything in motion. They reported both Zamil and Nahida missing. When campus police got involved, the situation escalated quickly. 2 people. Same location. Same timeline. Same silence. This wasn't coincidence. This was something else. Investigators began with the obvious. Where were they last seen? Who were they with? Who had access to them? The answers all pointed back to one place: their apartment. A quiet off-campus residence. Nothing flashy. Nothing suspicious on the surface. Just another student living space where late-night studying, shared meals, and academic stress were part of daily life. But inside that apartment, something had happened. And someone knew exactly what it was. Because Zamil didn't live alone. He shared that space with another student, Hisham Abugharbieh. At first, he was just part of the background. A roommate. Someone who saw them regularly. Someone who could provide answers. And in cases like this, roommates are often the first people investigators talk to. Routine questions. When did you last see them? Did anything seem unusual? Did they mention going anywhere? Simple questions. But sometimes the simplest questions lead to the most disturbing answers. As investigators began digging, small inconsistencies started to surface. Timelines that didn't quite align. Details that didn't fully make sense. Nothing definitive. Not yet. But enough to raise suspicion. And suspicion, in a case like this, is everything. Meanwhile, outside that apartment, the search intensified. Flyers went up. Friends spoke out. The university community grew restless. Because Zamil and Nahida weren't just names on a missing persons report. They were known, respected, ambitious. Two young people who had traveled thousands of miles from Bangladesh to build something better. A future. And now, they were gone. Days passed. Still nothing. No sightings. No confirmed activity. No trace. It was as if they had simply disappeared into thin air. But investigators knew better. People don't just vanish. Something always leaves a trace. You just have to find it. And then, a break. It didn't come from a witness. It didn't come from surveillance footage. It came from somewhere far more chilling. A location. The Howard Frankland Bridge. Authorities were called to the scene after a disturbing discovery. Something had been found. Something that would change the direction of the entire investigation.
I am joined here today by my good friend and University of South Florida Police Department Chief of Police, Chris Daniel. We are here today as our community has been shaken by the disappearance of two USF grad students, Nahida and Zamil. I am heartbroken to announce the discovery of human remains discovered on the Howard
When
Frankland
confirmation
Bridge
came in,
earlier this
it hit
morning.
hard.
Just now, those remains were positively
The body belonged to
identified
Zamil Limon,
to Zamil.
the same man who had been seen just days earlier, walking out of his apartment like any other morning. Now, he was gone. And just like that, the case shifted. This was no longer a missing persons investigation. This was a homicide. But the most terrifying part, Nahida Bristy was still missing. No body. No confirmed location. No answers. Just a growing fear that whatever happened to Zamil had happened to her too. As investigators returned to the apartment, everything became more urgent, more focused, more intense. Because now, they weren't just looking for clues. They were looking for a killer. And all roads led back to one person. The roommate. Hisham Abugharbieh. Behind closed doors, investigators began building a timeline. What happened between the last sighting and the discovery on the bridge? What occurred inside that apartment? What did Hisham see? Or more importantly, what did he do? The pressure mounted quickly. And then came the moment that changed everything. Law enforcement moved in. What followed wasn't calm. It wasn't cooperative. It turned into a standoff. A tense confrontation that suggested something far more serious was unfolding. Because people who have nothing to hide don't usually react like that. And when it was over, Hisham Abugharbieh was taken into custody. At first, the charges were limited. But as evidence began to surface, as investigators pieced together what happened inside that apartment, those charges escalated. 2 counts. First-degree premeditated murder. Not 1. 2. Even though only one body had been found. Which meant one thing. Authorities believed Nahida Bristy was dead, even without finding her. And that belief changed everything. Because now, the case wasn't just about what happened. It was about proving it. What evidence did they find inside that apartment? What led them to believe this was planned? And the biggest question of all, where is Nahida Bristy? Because somewhere out there is still a missing piece to this story. A piece that could reveal the truth. Or make this case even darker than anyone imagined. And as investigators continued their search, another discovery would soon surface. One that would raise even more questions. And push this case into even deeper mystery. If you think this story is already shocking, you haven't heard the most disturbing part yet. Make sure you subscribe to Crime Gazette, because what comes next will change everything you think you know about this case.
How did we get here today? We have a suspect in custody. How did that happen?
The arrest of Hisham Abugharbieh didn't bring relief. If anything, it made everything heavier. Because now investigators weren't asking if something had happened inside that apartment near the University of South Florida. They were asking how far it went. And more importantly, what they were about to uncover. The moment Hisham was taken into custody, detectives moved fast. Time mattered now. Every hour increased the risk of losing critical evidence. The apartment he once shared with Zamil Limon became the center of the investigation. It didn't look like a crime scene at first glance. That's what made it unsettling. No obvious signs of chaos. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. Just a quiet, ordinary space, books stacked neatly, research papers scattered across desks, a life mid-progress. But experienced investigators know something the public often doesn't. The most disturbing scenes don't always look disturbing. They're quiet. Controlled. Almost intentional. Forensic teams began their work carefully, methodically moving through each room. Every surface, every corner, every inch of that apartment was treated as potential evidence. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. Subtle things. Things most people would miss. But to trained eyes, they meant everything. There were inconsistencies. Signs that something had been cleaned. Not casually, but deliberately. Areas that didn't match the rest of the environment. Surfaces that looked too spotless. That kind of detail doesn't happen by accident. It suggests one thing. Someone was trying to erase something. And when someone tries to erase a scene, it usually means there was something worth hiding. Investigators expanded their search beyond the apartment. Security footage. Phone records. Digital activity. Anything that could help reconstruct the final hours of Zamil and Nahida. And what they found only deepened the mystery. Because after being seen that morning, their digital lives went dark. Completely. No calls. No texts. No logins. No movement. For 2 young people deeply connected to their work, their friends, and their families, that level of silence wasn't just unusual. It was unnatural. Then came the timeline reconstruction. Detectives began placing movements side by side. Zamil seen at 9 a.m. Nahida shortly after. Both last seen near the same location. And then, nothing. No confirmed sightings beyond that point. But one person remained in that space. One person whose movements now became critically important. Hisham. What was he doing during those hours? Where did he go? Who did he speak to? Those questions became the backbone of the case. And slowly, piece by piece, investigators began to build something far more serious than suspicion. They began building a narrative. One that pointed toward premeditation. Not a sudden argument. Not a random act of violence. But something planned. Something controlled. And that changed everything. Because premeditation carries weight. It means intent. It means decision. It means this wasn't chaos. This was calculated. Meanwhile, the discovery at the Howard Frankland Bridge continued to raise questions. Why there? Why that location? It wasn't random. It was a place where something could be hidden in plain sight. Busy enough to blend in. Remote enough to avoid immediate attention. And that kind of decision suggests awareness. Planning. Control. Investigators returned to the bridge area again and again. Search teams scanned the waters below. Divers moved carefully through murky depths. Because if Zamil had been found there, then Nahida could be too. But every search came back with the same result. Nothing. No sign of her. And that absence became louder with each passing day. Because in cases like this, the lack of evidence is evidence. It suggests movement. It suggests concealment. It suggests someone took steps to make sure she wouldn't be found. Back at the station, interrogations began. Hours of questioning. Repetition. Pressure. Detectives don't just look for answers. They look for cracks. Inconsistencies. Moments where the story shifts, even slightly. Because that's where the truth starts to break through. And according to investigators, the story wasn't holding together. Details didn't align. Explanations didn't match the evidence being collected. And when that happens, the focus sharpens. Because now, it's no longer about possibilities. It's about proving what already seems likely. But there was still one problem. A major one. Nahida Bristy was still missing. And without her, the case remained incomplete. Because finding her could answer everything. What exactly happened inside that apartment? Did she try to escape? Was she taken somewhere else? Was she still out there? Investigators refused to rule anything out. But as days turned into nearly 2 weeks, hope began to shift. From rescue to recovery. And that shift is one of the hardest moments in any case. Because it means the focus changes. It means the outcome investigators are preparing for is no longer the one anyone hoped for. Still, they kept searching. Because even if the outcome is tragic, answers matter. Closure matters. Truth matters. Then came another development. Something that didn't bring answers, but brought more questions. Additional human remains were discovered in the same general area connected to the investigation. Not immediately identified. Not immediately explained. Just found. And suddenly, the case expanded again. Because now investigators had to ask. Was this connected? Or was this something else entirely? Every possibility had to be considered. Every angle examined. Because in a case already filled with uncertainty, even one more unknown can change everything. Back in the courtroom, the charges against Hisham became clearer. 2 counts. First-degree premeditated murder. Not based on assumption. But based on evidence investigators believed was strong enough to support it. And that's significant. Because charges like that aren't filed lightly. They require a level of confidence. A belief that what happened wasn't just tragic. It was intentional. But the public still didn't know the full picture. What exactly led to this? What happened between these 3 people sharing a space? Were there tensions? Conflicts? Something hidden beneath the surface that no one else saw? Because from the outside, nothing seemed out of place. 3 students. Shared living space. Academic lives. Routine days. Until suddenly, everything changed. And that's what made this case so unsettling. There was no clear warning. No obvious escalation. Just a normal day. That ended in disappearance. And death. And as investigators continued to build their case, one question remained louder than all the rest. What really happened inside that apartment, in those missing hours? Because somewhere between the last sighting and the discovery on the bridge, something unfolded that changed everything. Something that turned a quiet student apartment into the center of a murder investigation. And until that moment is fully understood, this case isn't over. Not even close. The longer Nahida Bristy remained missing, the more this case refused to settle. It wasn't just the absence of answers. It was the weight of what those missing answers might reveal. Because by now, investigators were no longer trying to determine if a crime had occurred. They were trying to understand why. And that question led them back, again and again, to the same place. The apartment. The shared space between Zamil Limon, Nahida Bristy, and Hisham Abugharbieh. From the outside, it still looked ordinary. Neighbors described nothing unusual. No loud arguments. No disturbances. No obvious signs that something had been building beneath the surface. And that's what made it harder. Because when there's no visible conflict, the motive becomes harder to trace. But investigators don't rely on what's visible. They rely on patterns, behavior, data. And the deeper they dug, the more those patterns began to shift. Digital forensics became critical. Phones, laptops, messages, search histories. Everything that could capture even a fragment of what those final hours looked like. Because even when people disappear, their digital footprints often don't. And what investigators look for isn't just activity. It's change. Sudden silence. Interrupted routines. Unfinished conversations. Moments where life was moving normally, and then abruptly stopped. That's where the truth begins to surface. In this case, the silence wasn't gradual. It was immediate. Sharp. As if something had cut everything off at once. That kind of interruption doesn't happen by accident. It happens when something forces it. And that realization pushed the investigation deeper. Detectives began mapping movements inside the apartment. Not just where people were, but where they might have been. Reconstructing space. Reconstructing time. Trying to answer a simple but critical question. Where did everything change? Because there is always a moment. A point where normal turns into something else. And finding that moment can explain everything. At the same time, attention returned to the Howard Frankland Bridge. The location where Zamil was found wasn't just important. It was intentional. Investigators believed it wasn't random. It wasn't a place someone would end up by chance. It was chosen. And when a location is chosen, it tells you something about the person who chose it. Familiarity. Awareness. Planning. All of it pointed toward control. And control is what separates impulsive acts from deliberate ones. But even with that, something still didn't fit. If one body was placed there, why not both? Why was Nahida missing while Zamil had been found? That question became one of the most haunting parts of the case. Because it suggested difference. A different decision. A different action. Or a different outcome. And that difference mattered. Back in custody, Hisham Abugharbieh remained at the center of everything. Every piece of evidence. Every timeline. Every inconsistency. It all circled back to him. But even then, there were limits. Because without a full account of what happened, without Nahida, there were still gaps. And those gaps kept investigators working. Kept the case moving. Kept the pressure on. Meanwhile, the community around the University of South Florida began to feel the weight of it all. This wasn't just another case anymore. It was personal. Students who once walked the same paths, attended the same classes, shared the same spaces, now looked at everything differently. Because something had happened within their world. Something that shattered the idea of safety. And once that feeling is gone, it doesn't come back easily. Friends of Zamil and Nahida began speaking out. Not with answers, but with memories. Descriptions of who they were. What they were working toward. What they had planned next. Because that's what makes cases like this harder to process. It's not just about what happened. It's about what was lost. Potential. Future. Time that was never supposed to end like this. And while the public followed updates, investigators stayed focused on one thing. Closing the gap. Finding the missing piece. Because without it, the story remained incomplete. Then came another shift. Not a breakthrough, but something close. Evidence began to suggest that whatever happened inside that apartment didn't stay there. That movement was involved. That something, or someone, had been taken elsewhere. And that realization expanded the scope of the investigation. Because now it wasn't just about one location. It was about multiple movements, multiple decisions, each one narrowing the timeline, each one revealing intent. And with every step forward, the picture became clearer, but also darker. Because the more you understand a case like this, the more you realize how deliberate it may have been, how controlled, how planned. And that realization changes how you see everything. It turns a tragedy into something more unsettling, something harder to accept. Because it means this wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. It was chosen. And that brings the investigation back to the same question. Why? What led to this? What could have happened between three people sharing a space that ended like this? Was it conflict? Was it something hidden? Something no one else saw? Or something that built quietly, until it reached a breaking point? Investigators continue to search for that answer. But answers don't always come quickly. Sometimes they take time. Sometimes they require one final piece. And in this case, that piece still hasn't been found. Because somewhere out there is still a missing person, a missing truth, a missing moment that could explain everything. And until Nahida Bristy is found, until that final question is answered, this case remains unfinished. Not just in the eyes of investigators, but in the minds of everyone following it. Because the story doesn't end with what we know. It ends with what we don't. And right now, there's still too much missing. If this story shook you, don't just scroll past it. Cases like this deserve attention, because someone is still missing, and the truth is still unfolding. Subscribe to Crime Gazette and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update. And tell me in the comments, what do you think really happened inside that apartment? Because sometimes, the scariest part of a story isn't what we know. It's what's still missing.